Welcome everyone to this penultimate event of the 2021 OECD Business Integrity Roundtable. Today's event focuses on non-judicial remedial mechanisms for remedying solicitation, bribery, and corruption. For those interested, the final event will be on 12th of May and will concern business integrity developments in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and there's still time to register. I have two quick logistical points before we begin. The first is this presentation is being recorded, as you just heard, and the recording will later be available with the other recordings of the various roundtable events on the OECD website. The second information I'd like to tell you is that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we're very fortunate to have 6 panelists with a wealth of knowledge about their respective non-judicial mechanisms. But the whole purpose of the roundtable is to encourage participation and to learn from each other. At last count, we had participants in the audience from over 39 different countries. And so we really would encourage you to share your perspectives and questions for the panelists so that the moderator and panelists can work them into the conversation over the course of the discussion. And finally, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Ms. Enrique Quinones, who has a wealth of experience in anti-corruption and integrity. Currently, she acts as the chair of various panels and bodies for international financial institutions and the United Nations. And of particular relevance to this discussion, she previously worked at the OECD for many years, both with the guidelines for multinational enterprises, which is relevant to the national contact points that you'll hear about today. And she also acted as the head of the anti-corruption division, which supports the working group on bribery. Following the OECD, she joined the EBRD, where she served as chief compliance officer and was involved with the Ukraine Ombudsman, which is another mechanism you'll hear about today. So we're very fortunate to have her leading this conversation. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Enrique.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Brooks. Thank you, Olga. Thank you to the OECD Secretariat for their support. And welcome to all of the participants wherever in the world you may be. I hope you'll find this session to be relevant, perhaps give you some ideas as to how to address some of the issues that you may think would respond well to this type of a mechanism. As Brooks said, we're fortunate to have 6 panelists. The 6 panelists represent different types of non-judicial mechanisms, and they perhaps would have in common, I would say, the environment in which from which they originated. And so we have ombudsman type mechanisms, we have high-level reporting mechanisms, we have a combination of these, as well as the national contact point. So perhaps an underlying rationale, I would say, is a lot of these environments where these mechanisms grew up were perhaps characterized by systemic issues of corruption, weak institutions, weak rule of law, or perhaps just the desire to avoid costly and lengthy judicial procedures, and also perhaps to avoid or to provide a more amicable mediation process for participants who want to work together to solve problems. So we're going to hear from all of these participants. I've asked them not to describe in detail the different mechanisms, but we will be addressing 3 questions. And through these 3 questions, I think we will be able to understand how these mechanisms function and the differences and the similarities. So the first question that I would like the panelists to address, and we're going to address them in order. So all of the panelists will address the first questions, then all of the panelists the second, and then finally all of the panelists the last question. This doesn't mean that the audience cannot be interactive. If they really have a question they would want to put, please put this in the chat room. Otherwise, we will do that at the very end. So the first question that I would like the panelists to address is really, what was the underlying reason for seeking an alternative problems? What was the driving force, or who was the driving force? And basically, you know, this was the inspiration, or this was the desire that led to the creation of this particular mechanism. That's the first question. The second question is really going to be more focused on, okay, this mechanism, whatever the problems were in setting it up, is up and running, but there are some challenges in implementation. What are these challenges and how are they being addressed? That's the second area. Finally, the last question that the panelists will address is really more a sense of, we've identified the problem that led to the creation of these mechanisms in the first place. Now we want to say, after some time of operation, has this mechanism delivered? Has this mechanism been able to address those problems? So in other words, the achievements, the successes, and perhaps the failures. If it's failed or failed in part, please describe why it's failed and how it should be designed differently. So these are the three different sets of questions that will be addressed. And as I said, in the process, you will understand the different mechanisms that are being used to address these problems. So I will turn to Juraj, who was my deputy at the EBRD. I had the great pleasure of working with him. And Juraj has a wealth of knowledge, particularly with respect to the Ukrainian businessmen, with which we work together. So Juraj, over to you.
Thank you, Anari, and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are on this planet. I indeed had the good fortune of being involved with the Business Ombudsman Institution and working with in Ukraine and working with Anari on this project, in structuring it. And then I spent 2.5 years in Ukraine implementing this project. The reason why we came up with the concept was that there was endemic corruption. Indeed, I mean, all the issues that Anari mentioned were present in Ukraine as we founded in 2013, and EBRD is a large investor in Ukraine. And what we wanted to achieve by this project, by the government signing a memorandum of understanding for we call it for the Ukrainian Anti-Corruption Initiative, was to bring them to accept that indeed endemic corruption is a problem, that unfair treatment of businesses is an issue in Ukraine, and that the government acknowledges that it has to do something about it. We were negotiating with the government of the day, and we were just supposed to sign the memorandum when the revolution came up, because the government was not willing to sign, on one hand, memorandum of understanding with us, on the other hand, association agreement with the EU. All of that collapsed, the revolution came, and we started the project because the new government, which came in 2014, was willing to recognize all of those things. They signed a memorandum and were willing to set up an institution, an independent institution. The reason why we went for a non-judicial body was that judiciary was, and probably till today, is one of the most corrupt parts of the government. And that's where we were coming with an independent body. Independence and ability, efficiency to investigate were really the underlying issues that we were thinking in setting up this institution. And that's what we put in the memorandum, and that's also what we put in the governance documents which underpin the institution. So that really was where we started, and that was the basis for what we came up with. That's it. I'll stop there. We can't hear you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and thanks for keeping to the time as well. And I will then ask, perhaps Soji, maybe perhaps because your mechanism is a bit of a combination of a high-level of an ombudsman and a high-level reporting mechanism, if I'm not mistaken, or is it just a straight high-level reporting mechanism? But I'll ask Soji to go next, if you don't mind.
Okay, thank you very much, Anari. It was a similar set of reasons for which this was set up in Nigeria. Rampant demands for bribes, facilitation payments within the maritime sector. And it was the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, particularly concerned about the liability that if ship captains continued to oblige public officials with the bribes they were demanding and the facilitation payments, that this would put them at a very great risk as a company. And it was how to tackle that got them to write to the Nigerian government in 2012 to ask that something be done about the high levels of corruption within the ports. And when they carried out a corruption risk assessment, one of the conclusions was that the standard operating procedures were not very clear to everyone. And but then the private sector then said, well, what if the officials don't abide by the standard operating procedures? What do we do? And this was what then necessitated some kind of high-level reporting mechanism where they could report when the standard operating procedures were not being followed. Otherwise, the business ombudsman was, that role was being taken by the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network itself and through our activities here in Nigeria. So I think really in terms of the problem, it was driven by the incessant requests for facilitation payments and also the fear by the companies behind the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network that they were at risk because of laws that had the reach across all sorts of jurisdictions of the world, like the UK Bribery Act. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good. Also, thank you for keeping to timing. So next, perhaps Camillo, maybe you can take up give us a little bit about the background of your mechanism.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Well, the high-level reporting mechanism was initially adopted as a non-judicial, mechanism for dealing with corruption cases in infrastructure. It was initially suggested, actually, during the OECD accession process from the government of Colombia. We started back in 2013, I guess. Yeah, 2013. And well, we did the pilot for the big infrastructure projects that were by then, and they are still now, addressed and led by the National Infrastructure Agency. So, as you may know, in infrastructure it's very easy to hide some irregular payments or facilitation payments because of this critical mass of capital you need for big infrastructure projects. And you cannot find, it's difficult to find or to identify exactly two projects, projects or three equal projects is very difficult. Every project infrastructure is unique. So it is also very easy to somehow manipulate the tender process and the awarding process of the contracts for particular or special, potential bidders. So we decided to pull this or to put in motion this pool of experts from the infrastructure sector, like engineers, also experts in corporate finance, also experts in law, and also experts in compliance and anti-corruption. So they will receive any potential complaint and report on potential corruption cases during the tender process of the big infrastructure projects that by then were formulated, right? So they will be able to take the report to actually study what's going on and to define what will be the main way to address the potential problems. Sometimes actually it's not corruption what's going on there, but maybe it could be a problem of language. Maybe there is a serious flaw within the project design, or it could be something else, a mistake in the documentation process or something like that. So they will address the problem directly. They will acknowledge the problem to the different bidders and report also to the president of the National Infrastructure Agency. Now, should they find any irregular, behavior there that could be actually breaking the law in a serious way, then they will report to the national prosecutor or maybe national inspector here. So that will be that. Those were the main reasons there, right? Like OECD accession process, how difficult infrastructure projects are, and also how necessary was by them to provide to bidders, guarantee that they will have a nice environment to compete for a fair environment to compete for projects in Colombia. That's all.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you very, very much. Rustam, would you like to take the floor next?
Yes, thank you so much. Let me briefly introduce myself. Rustam Josonov, I'm the Business Ombudsman of Kazakhstan. My office responded by 130 experts in all 17 regions of the Kazakhstan. But the most unique case that the office, my office, gets finance and gets the resources from national chambers of commerce. So the National Chamber gave us the financing and the resources to do our job. So corruption in Kazakhstan is a significant problem, as all countries, for the economic and political development. Overcoming corruption is one of our main targets. So the reasons that we provide the non-judicial method, it's legislation completed and repressive sometimes. So in accordance with our analysis, we provide three groups of our activity. First of all, it's a pre-trial method for dispute settlement, because I strongly believe that any legislation with the state, it's a shock for business. And we're trying to avoid it. We help our business entities with their claims. From the 2016, we provide more than 27,000 cases. And of course, the mediation, especially with the tax and custom disputes. It's very important. Another case, it's states procurement issues. It's a very rich zone, and we provide our activity. We has become a qualified tools. We call it single purchasing windows project. So it's a kind of tool, BI system, that connected with the state's procurement platforms. And we can manage and monitoring all the procurement deals in the perimeter of the 9 platforms. In 2002, we can monitor more than 1,140,000 contracts. Its capacity about the 12 billion euro. So we monitor and we see the all risk with the corruptions, and we give our monitoring to the state and our state bodies. In July of that year, we are going to start new project. We call it business register. So it's a database for all legal entities, and we will provide informational. We will integrate it with the several database, state database, and provide services to complete all information. It will help us to reduce the shadow economy in general. So on the basis of business register, we will do some indexes, such as business reputation, payment and credit discipline, financial stability, due diligence, etc. It will help us to reduce the shadow economy. And of course, we have another activity. It's in general one. It's an activity with the business regulations. We, together with our state, provided some reform, which we call the smart regulation, to reduce the pressure of the government in the economy. We are going to implement one in, two out, regulatory guillotine, regulatory sandbox, etc. So briefly, that's
Let me just interrupt because I'd like to get into implementation issues a little bit in the next question. So if you can hold
okay
on the implementation part.
Okay.
And I would then like to give the floor to our speaker, Guillermo, please.
Thank you so much, Henry. Hello, everyone, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for having me here. I'm going to share with you my experience with two different mechanisms that non-judicial mechanisms that have been implemented in Argentina. One is a high-level reporting mechanism that we can compare what Camilo just said a few minutes ago. The reason for setting up a high-level reporting mechanism in Argentina is more related, was also for infrastructure projects. The administration launched a huge plan of infrastructure, and one of the legal instruments accompanying that plan was a public-private participation law as a vehicle for financing these projects. And the opposition at that time was very critical as the transparency, or they brought other experiences of corruption with private-public participation from other parts of the world. And so there was a huge political debate whether this finance mechanism for infrastructure was the right one. And the government set up, surrounded this infrastructure plan with several transparency mechanisms to, satisfy the social demand that the plan would be transparent and free of corruption. And the high-level mechanism, the high-level reporting mechanism, was one of the instruments that was accompanying this infrastructure. The second non-judicial mechanism I would like to share with you is something very similar to what Soji commented in Nigeria, and it was my experience with the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network Collective Action Project in Argentina. The reason was exactly the same as it was in Nigeria. It was systematic solicitation of bribes to approve a specific inspection of some types of ships exporting grain from Argentina. So at the time of loading the grain, there was systematic solicitation. At that time, we had a baseline of more than 95% of cases of solicitations. It was really a structural problem. And I would say, there was the mechanism I will comment in this initiative was part of a broader strategy, but we collect information and we use that information in that broader strategy that I will comment in the second question.
Great, thank you very much. So we have one final speaker, and last but not least on this particular topic. Marcella, will you please take the floor?
Thank you, Henry, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks, OECD, for this invitation. And in our case, the national contact points are special and different mechanism from the ones shared right now because it has a multilateral character. The mechanism emerged from the Declaration on International Investment and Multinational Enterprises, which was signed or adopted in 1976, at which time, I believe, I wasn't there, that globalization and emerging challenges across different countries called for a flexible yet cooperative system to guide international business in this globalized context. So if we look at the considerations that were made and they're still there in the document, it calls for the role of international investment as a major role in development, the cooperation, international cooperation as a way to improve foreign investment, and overall the role that multinational enterprises have in this, and how balanced framework of interrelated instruments can help to improve this ecosystem. Within this declaration, there is a specific set of guidelines that governments jointly recommend to multinational enterprises to conduct and observe. Now, these guidelines covered a wide range of business responsibility areas, including human rights, employment and industrial relations, environment, competition and taxation, and also anti-corruption. Therefore, the mechanism as a whole and the set of recommendations, it's not only for remedying solicitation, bribery, and corruption, but that is included in this context of responsible business conduct. At the beginning, this mechanism didn't necessarily call for this NCP's entity. This started in 1984, so 8 years after the declaration was established. The NCPs as mechanism were designed first for promoting the guidelines and responding to inquiries. And in the year 2000, the NCPs were given the role to foster solutions in relation to issues emerging from the implementation of the guidelines as a remedy mechanism. Now we have online this 20 years and the road ahead report of this 20 years providing access to remedy. So in the overall, what we have right now is that the OECD guidelines are the only international responsible business conduct instrument in this multilateral context of the OECD that includes a built-in state-based grievance mechanism and that currently works with a network of 49 NCPs, Chile having one of them, which I'm representing. So somehow this introduction calls for the whole mechanism, and I'm here a bit representing the whole network as well. So this is what I can share now, Anna-Marie. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, panel. Okay, so we're really ready now to tackle the second question, which is, what have been the challenges in implementation? Has there been blowback? Is there lack of transparency? Is there lack of resources? Is there simply the fact that the mechanisms are not well understood, or that the scope of these mechanisms are quite narrow and perhaps need to be broadened? So really, let's try and focus in, narrow in on how these mechanisms are actually, implemented right now. So we'll start on the way we did. I'll start with Marcella, because you were the last one to go. So I'll ask you to be the first one now on this topic, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Don't worry. Thank you. So, well, following what I was sharing with you, the NCP mandate has been growing with years, right? Mm-hmm. So for us, there's two areas where we can contribute and then where challenges and problems could be identified. One is obviously raising awareness and having more a preventive view based on multi-stakeholder cooperation. And I think in the context of fighting corruption, this is key. The other one that is probably the most highlighted one has to do with the good offices that are provided, that as a non-judicial character, it can include a very wide range of possibilities, from informal dialogue and facilitating negotiations to professional mediation, depending on the development of HNCP and the mechanisms that are set in place. Now, in this wide range of issues that the guidelines cover, obviously bribery and integrity have a particular nature, so to speak. And for us, that we might be more used to issues that impact wide ranges of population, environmental issues, human rights issues. Somehow bribery could be a victimless crime or less evident in terms of that it's the whole economy more than a specific set of people or persons that are affected. So I linked this with the issue that NCPs as a mechanism emerged later in the life of this instrument. The question would be, are all the issues covered in the guidelines subject to the same way of intervention from the NCP side? And maybe this will depend, and we should clarify this in order to foster what we can do and leave to courts what they should be doing as well. In our case, we also cover and implement the Anti-Bribery Convention from the Responsible Business Conduct Division, which is very relevant for bribery in international businesses. That is the area covered by the guidelines. And this ability to look at both worlds, I think it helps us to see that there is room for better collaborating. Now, just one point. Last point, what needs to happen for that to be more increased? Probably clarified our relationship with the judicial mechanisms, because the NCP will not replace the criminal prosecution. Like what Camila said, obviously, if we receive something that look like foreign bribery or another type of crime, we would need to send this to our PPO, that's for sure. But then what else we could do? And I think there is a question that maybe we could address in the last set of questions. Thank you, Anna.
Yes, thank you very much. In fact, this last point you raised, you really anticipated what was going to be my question to the panelists at the end, which essentially you can all start thinking about it. Exactly that is like, what do the mechanisms do in the case where, you know, basically they are perhaps dealing with something which is potentially criminal? What is the obligation? What is the interaction with the official mechanism at that stage? But anyway, let's continue on this particular topic, the challenges. And so then I'll go back to Juraj. I'm familiar with some of the challenges, but perhaps you can expand a little bit more in Ukraine. How it's going?
Thank you, Henry. And I'll put my timer on so that I don't overrun. Just very briefly, how do you ensure that a body which has been set up to investigate wrongdoings by the authorities to the private or to businesses in general, how can they be independent on one hand, and how can they be taken seriously by the authorities? What structure can you impose to be able to strike that balance? And that has been the most difficult challenge. And also for the institution not to be seen as a lobbying tool of the businesses. So you need to strike the right balance between the independence and having some teeth and efficiency, and also to be listened by the authorities and for the authorities to cooperate with you, to provide information in the context of investigations, to deal with individual recommendations, and then also to deal with systemic recommendations, because the Ombudsman does not only deal with individual cases, but they look at patterns and prepare semi-annual systemic reports, which then the authorities are required to implement. This also has to be put in the picture of how the Ombudsman exists in Ukraine. The Ukraine Ombudsman is only at the moment still an advisory body to the government of Ukraine. The first thing that I was working on back in 2014 was the law on, not the first, but one of the first things, law on the Ombudsman institution. The law has still not been adopted. I understand that it is now in an advanced stage of discussion within the parliament. It has been approved by the relevant committee, but still, without a proper law, it's very difficult to operate. We were relying on the gravitas of the Ombudsman, and we have purposefully put an Ombudsman who was not a national of Ukraine. We have put a former EU commissioner who understood Ukraine very well. He was Lithuanian as the first Ombudsman, but nevertheless relying in the long run on the authority of someone who has the support of the government, but it's mostly political support rather than being operating on the basis of a law is very, very difficult. So this really has been a challenge and continues to be a challenge for the institution. So I would stop there.
Understood. And is he still the Ombudsman?
No, he stepped down in 2019 and has been replaced by a Polish national, a former mayor of Warsaw, who is now the Ukrainian Ombudsman. So again, a non-national of Ukraine, just to keep the independence of the institution. Yeah, I will stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So Rustam, would you like to take up this question next?
Yes, I agree with my Ukrainian colleague, and it's very important to find the balance between the interest of states and the business entities and the business community in general. So in my case, I do my activities in accordance with the law. And we have the commercial code, and we have the special articles regarding my activity. And I'm get my appointed and held only by president, under control of the president of the Republic of Kazakhstan. And the national chambers give us the all necessary resources as well. So it's our unique case. In case of our analytic tools, etc., of course, we started to change the legislation 3 years ago. It takes 3 years to change the legislation. It was quite hard, you know. And of course, collect the all information, because information it's very important in our tools. And from the other hand, from the state bodies, they have the passive behavior, and we push it and to do our best to realize our project. Frankly speaking,
thank you. So by passive behavior, do you mean that they are unwilling to implement the recommendations or the solutions that are provided?
Yes, exactly.
Okay. And they don't necessarily have to justify the reasons for that?
Yeah, for them, it's more reasonable to do the business as usual, no changes.
Of course. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Camilo, you want to go next, please? What are the challenges?
Yes, of course. Well, the first challenge for the high-level reporting mechanism was the funding. The money we need this to put it in motion. Who is going to pay these experts or for this expert, right? Because the tendering agency cannot pay because there is a conflict of interest. If the private sector pays, there is a conflict of interest as well, right? And we are actually trying to avoid that kind of problem. So what we did was we raised some resources, some money from the delegation of the European Union. So the European Cooperation, International Cooperation, actually funded the first pilot here for paying the experts, for selecting the experts, and for putting in motion the program, the mechanism. So that's one thing. Once you have that solved, there is another challenge, which is procedures. Because also, I mean, as it happens in justice, for instance, you need a clear procedure that is accountable for everyone and also provides a fair environment and trustable environment for proceeding with the reports, for being accountable about what we are doing with the reports, and for making everyone feel comfortable with what they are reporting about, right? So that was another thing. So we actually devised a sort of code in which we describe how the reports were supposed to be, issued by the private sector, was supposed to be, how they were supposed to be managed by the different experts, and what kind of information we're going to provide about what we did with those reports. So that was another thing. And finally, there is also some sort of dialogue with the private sector, because this was new. So people were asking questions on, okay, but what actually are the consequences of my report, or what's going on with what I already said about this tender process, and things like that. So we try to educate the different bidders and the different firms interested in this big concession and public-private partnership processes for infrastructure. And we also define with them some sort of code of conduct, because also the private sector, among them, they have this twisted behavior in which they try to sabotage each other, interest for being awarded with the contracts, right? So sometimes you get these reports about the other bidder, which maybe cannot be that trustable. They just want to sabotage that guy, and so we try to issue a code of conduct. Okay, if you guys want to do this and you trust this is going to work, we also need a proof of a good behavior from your part or from your side. And we did that, and actually that helped a lot for the mechanisms to work. That's all.
I guess that can be very tricky because we have seen in procurement issues that a lot of companies take very generous advantage of the procedures to complain and to raise certain types of issues, which are fundamentally economic rivalry issues and not necessarily corruption issues, but they are usually framed in the context of this is potentially corruption. And I would imagine that some companies as well might have some fear in reporting some aspects because this might turn against them. So anyway, thank you very much. Let's now go to Guillermo and have some insights as to the challenges.
Thank you, Henry. So with regard to the high-level reporting mechanism, unlike the case Camilo just described in Colombia, the high-level reporting mechanism in Argentina was very much narrow in scope. The government was in a hurry to launch the infrastructure project, so there was at the same time trying to access to the OECD. So there were some recommendation from the OECD, some technical assistance from the Basic Institute on Governance, but at the end of the day, the mechanism was just a contract clause included in the bill specification process. There was no education to the private sector, at least as far as I know. I was a member of the expert panels reviewing the complaints. So my senses was that everything was done. There were no experts because the scope was limited to the bidding process, but the mechanism was not planned to be active during the execution of the projects. So, you know, it lasts for a few months. We received, I think, 5 reports. None of them were related to corruption, but rather to other aspects that Camilo was mentioning, you know, the failures in the specification aspects. So, you know, not many challenges of implementation in a mechanism that it was so narrow in scope. Let me now turn to the non-judicial mechanism that we use in the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. There was no challenges in setting up the mechanism because the mechanism was already set up by the network. The network already had a reporting mechanism for member companies of the network reporting solicitation anywhere of the world. What we did was we set up a working group with those companies doing businesses in Argentina. We talked to them, we said, we need you to use this mechanism in a very systematic and serious way. They were, of course, afraid of, okay, how are you going to use this information? And we decided not to use the information as it is, because it's very easy to identify, you know, the ship, the port, the agent, who was involved in that specific instance of solicitation. And of course, everyone was afraid of retaliation with the next ship coming to Argentina. So, but what we did was we used the information on an aggregate basis, on a quarterly, every quarter of the year, we put all the information together and we went to the government and said, look, there has been these problems in this port, there has been that other problems in the port. And we use this to create trust, because I think that the most important problem here was lack of trust. After some fact-finding, we find out that this was not just public corruption, it was a huge public-private network of, you know, mid-rank officials in the ports, with the port agents, with the private surveyors, and even sometimes with the captains of the ships of our clients. So, you know, to disarticulate all this network, we start, you know, persuading people basically and companies that everyone in Argentina was basically acting against the interest of their own principals. And we create some critical mass, and we use the information of the reporting mechanism of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network to bring this information to the government, ask the government to produce some changes. For instance, in that port, ex-public official was moved to, I don't know, from the inspection to the desk. And, 3 months later, we came back with the information and said, okay, the solicitation diminished here or increased here. So we were using the information that way, and each change was creating trust among the stakeholders of the collective action. And I think that, this information is very powerful. So if you use it in a way that is able to produce some change, and you show the stakeholders that change is actually occurring, you increase trust, and everyone, they start to use this mechanism in a more regular basis. And I think that was, one important part of the strategy to produce the change.
Okay, you're getting slowly into the success of this mechanism as well, which I think more is later. Okay, let me go now to Soji, the last one on this topic.
Okay, thank you so much. If I may just mention something that I left out the first time, which was that to use the judicial route in Nigeria is usually a multi-year effort. And for the maritime industry, where predictability of cost and time, and they're looking for quick turnarounds, typically in like a couple of days or 3 days, it just wasn't an option to go with the judicial route. So in terms of the challenges, the biggest challenge we had was in getting access to government-held data. As Guillermo has already mentioned, the MACN has its own reporting mechanism, but that we found it very difficult to use that to make arguments in Nigeria, because the government agencies could easily say that, no, we don't agree with what you're quoting. So we developed a help desk here in Nigeria so that as member vessels are coming to Nigeria, they would give us a pre-arrival notice like 7 days before, which also goes to the Shippers Council. And then we would track their passage through the ports and terminals in Nigeria and track them until they left. The same way that was transparent also to the government agencies. And that way we were able to tell in how many cases there really were, and whether the members were having the challenges that we claimed were occurring with bribery and other issues. So that is how we were able to get over that, by keeping our own data, sharing it with them, and together looking at the same data, which they couldn't do with the MACN held data. But the other problem we had was with consequence management, because we found we were able now to advocate. So like 4 years ago, it was like 9 out of 10 visits having a challenge. And after intervening, very often the issue would be resolved, but we were never sure if it was the member company that had actually done an infraction, or whether the fines that were being levied by the government official were real fines, because usually the government would just allow the vessel to go. So we then insisted on a consequence management system to be put in place as well. So that's the second challenge. Third challenge was the behavior change, because the captains were terrified of even visiting any port or terminal in the Gulf of Guinea. It was a big issue for many of them. We even heard stories of some captains resigning instead of piloting a vessel to the Gulf of Guinea. So getting behavior change and getting the captains to actually just carry out a few simple acts, like informing us in advance, calling us up if they had any problems so we could escalate it, that was a major effort. And then also we found that rank and file officers within the government agencies were not even aware of what was written in their own standard operating procedures. So awareness raising, both for the private sector generally and for the government side, was a big task. Then finally, funding, because even when we trained the trainer many years ago, we couldn't get them to roll it out because none of them could get a budget from their agencies. So it was still MACN that had to come back and do the rollout of the training to about 1,000 senior government officials across many ports in Nigeria. So that has been like a summary of the kind of challenges that we've been having.
Okay, thank you very much. That really leads me into the second area, which is you mentioned all of these different challenges, some of which I think in what you're saying seem to be at least partially addressed, but some of them still seem to be quite difficult. But overall, and this takes us all, the panel, into our last question, what is your assessment as to how well the mechanism has achieved at least, if not all of its goals, but at least part of its goals? And if you were to redesign this mechanism starting from scratch, what would you do? Sorry, Soji, if you don't mind picking it up.
Okay, thank you. I think that, like I mentioned, like 3-4 years ago, it would take us roughly 72 hours to try to resolve an issue. And it was like 9 out of 10 visits that were having issues. But between last year and now, we've had about 160 assisted visits in the way that I described, and only 26 incidents. And of the 26 incidents, only 2 were valid. Only 24 were valid, 2 were not valid. And all the 24 were resolved between 1 and 4 hours, which is tolerable while the vessel is offloading or loading, it's all resolved before they leave. So it's not really adding extra time. And therefore things are getting more predictable in terms of time and cost. So that part we've achieved. But the part of then ensuring that government officials who ask for bribes, that they are sanctioned and do not ask for those bribes again, that is where we're still having a challenge. And now we're working with the authorities to now have compliance units in each of the agencies. So it's not dependent just on the efforts of MACN, but there's something from within that is reminding rank and file officers of their standard operating procedures and their ethical obligations as well in their conduct. So that is where we are right now in the project, trying to resolve that specific challenge of how to reassure members that the government is truly doing something about corruption in those places.
And just let me ask you, you mentioned this behavior, this fear, and have you noticed that indeed this has been to a large extent ameliorated by the mechanism and the success that you've had?
Yes, I'm happy to report that we get calls from captains and they've been passing our phone numbers and helplines between each other. So they start to contact us well before they come into Nigerian waters, and they know that there are real human beings expecting them, and that, and we also provide WhatsApp lines as well. So even on WhatsApp, they tell us what is going on, and we just reassure them, calm them, and sometimes they even ask for clarification. Is it okay? They're asking for a case of soft drinks. Should we give them or not? It's down to that kind of granular level, and they're getting that hand-holding. So there's a lot more confidence now, and there are many companies who don't even bother to use the help desk anymore. They come in and out without incident, and if there's an incident, they're confident enough to deal with it without having to pay now.
That's good. That's very good news. Okay, so let's go now to Rustam. Would you like to address that same question?
Yes, of course. So we closely cooperate with the government, of course, because you know it's our main partner, and with the key state agencies such as the General Prosecutor's Office, Supreme Court, Anti-Corruption Agency, of course, Financial Monitoring Agency. So we find these systematic issues on business are included to our special register of systematic problem. So we collected, and together with the government, we trying to solve it. For instance, the register included 737 questions, which is resolved more than 72%. And year by year, we reduced it. We have with all that state bodies, for instance, the General Prosecutor's offices, we have the yearly based action plan to solve the problem. So therefore, our mediation and the non-judicial method give us the result. As I told you earlier, from the 2016, we review and we receive more than 27,000 claims from the business, and resolve more than 40% as a positive. It's a good. And the total amount of protected property rights around 390 million euro. It's a good result, as we understand. The over dynamic of requests shows the decrease around 28% per year. Plus, in case of our unique project single purchasing windows, last year we identified purchasing with the unreasonable high prices for total more than 43 million euro, and we gave our recommendation to reduce it. And measures have already been taken to reduce the permits for business more than 74%, and business requirement by the 56%, and the optimized control function of the state bodies around the 30%. This is our results.
Thank you very much. You did mention that there was often on the part of the government a slowness in addressing some of the recommendations. But from what you're saying, it seems as if over time this is becoming better. But I'm just, perhaps another follow-up question is, how do you think this could even become a stronger mechanism in that respect? Is there some way, or just keep little by little making inroads?
Step by step. Every year we send our roadmaps. We identified around the 40, 60 problems. And together with the government, we solve the problem. Because our government understands that the business, this is an economic base for economy.
That's a good reason. Okay. Guillermo, please, next.
Thank you. So with regard to the high-level reporting mechanism, there is not much to say. The process were awarded after 2 months. There was a huge corruption scandal known as the notebooks scandal in Argentina. It's like a Lava Jato in Brazil, a cartel of corruption among construction companies. The 6 companies that were awarded these infrastructure projects were involved in that scandal. So they were absolutely unable to get finance from international lenders because, they didn't pass through a due diligence process. So at the end of the day, there is not much to say about, the effectiveness of this mechanism in Argentina. With regard to the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network experience, that was a very successful experience. We, at the end, reduced solicitation by more than 90%. The reporting mechanism was key to, as I said in the prior intervention, was key to create trust among stakeholders. And that trust allowed the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network to step down from funding, and we created a local group, and the local group continues working together. We meet every 2 months alone, and every 3 months with the authority. We still review the information, we still review the incidents. There is a lot of trust, even it has been a change in administration a year ago. And of course, there was much less activity during the pandemic, but even now we continue doing this over Zoom. And I think that we achieve a sense of trust and a sense that everyone is much better off without solicitation and without paying bribes. That's we were able to maintain this success. There was a bit of companies were a bit afraid when there was a change of government here, because it was the same government or the same political sign that was very much or that was in the administration when this rampant corruption increased, like 8 years ago in Argentina. Because this started as a simple bottle of whiskey or some cigarettes to $100 to $1,000 to $10,000. That was the average in 2015 of the bribes solicited in Argentina. But fortunately, we were able to persuade the authorities that there is a group of people working together here. We've been working for the last 5 years, and we plan to continue working. And this is the tools that we have, and so far it continues.
Good. All right. Thank you very much.
Working.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Next on my list, Camilo, please.
Yeah. Well, my assessment is good. It was a good experience, but it doesn't rule out the possibility for improvement, right? So the last experience that we had in Colombia with that mechanism, with the high-level reporting mechanism, was the metro of Bogota. As some of you people may not know, Bogota doesn't have a metro as a massive transport system that you can find in Washington or Paris or London, sorry. So we had, and the government of Bogota had to go for a tender to build the first line of the metro project. So they implemented that in a very, very good way, far better than the first pilot we did back in 2013. They signed a memorandum of understanding with the Basilea Institute, OECD, the government of Colombia, the government of Bogota. They worked together to define a protocol on how to implement the mechanism, to appoint the experts. They actually run a very formal procedure. The CVs of every candidate to be an expert was published for public comments, and for any objections that any person or any citizen could raise about these potential experts. Finally, they were appointed. They defined it as well, specific behaviors they will analyze, like collusion, corruption, fraud, obstruction. They were very specific in every single behavior that they could, have the competence, to actually examine and or to assess, and finally they also gave public reports on the work they did. Now the metro has been awarded to a international firm. The project is being implemented in a very good way, and you don't find any corruption scandal about it. The private sector was pretty satisfied with the competition process, with the tender process, with the bidding procedures. I think the metro experience was far better than the pilot, and I think the documents they have on their experience could be used for any other stakeholder or government that could be interested in implementing this, because it was very, very good experience and properly supervised as well, properly supervised. So I think the assessment is you can find nice experience, but there is also a large room for improvement that can make things work in a better way.
Yeah, but you have a solid basis that can be replicated if need be. Okay.
Yeah, that's right.
All right. So Marcella, please. Next.
Sure. Thank you, Aneri. So, well, in general, one could see that the guidelines have been successful providing a compass to companies in terms of how to behave in an international context, considering anti-corruption measures as an essential element of responsible business conduct, and including this, the fight against foreign bribery. So at least in terms of where to go, well, there is the framework. Now, when we go to the cases and the proper, non-judicial mechanism, the network of 49 NCPs has handled over 500 cases, from which only 40 include the reference to the anti-corruption chapter. Now, I was digging in a little bit in the database, and regarding the status, I could see that the acceptance rate of cases, including anti-corruption chapter, was very low compared to the overall rate. So if, for example, 60% of the cases involving anti-corruption were not accepted from within the network, that is almost double than the 34% of the overall 500 cases, or even the 34% of cases, including the human rights chapter that I looked at just as a way of comparison. So that shows that there is some challenges, or there is something that we need to look at in terms of, well, is it that the mechanism is not going to work for anti-corruption as much as for other issues because of the challenges that we mentioned in the last question, or there's something that we can do in order to improve this. Another element that I thought it was interesting that relates with the other mechanisms is that the sectors that are mainly being part of these cases. So we have the majority is manufacturing, then we have mining and quarrying, and transportation and storage. Those are the three main sectors that were included in these 40 cases. And just one case that I thought it was interesting, it wasn't one that we overviewed, so just bear with me, this was from the US NCP, that it was two non-governmental organizations that were advocating for community rights in Cameroon, and there was a specific company that was linked to a New York-based agriculture company operating in Ghana and Cameroon. And in this case, they claimed that the company was using some intimidation and bribery, targeting chiefs in order to get land and negotiating land. So in this process, they requested the NCP's intermediation to have this stop and also have some public statement and develop clear procedures for stakeholder engagement. And after the NCP's intervention, there was an agreement. It was a very basic one, but still it was a commitment from the company to received allegations from past cases, provide written responses, and somehow commit to reinforce their procedures. So this is linked to where I see that there is a very big option for a collaboration or improvement with the private sector that has to do with improve the mechanism. So risk-based due diligence is an essential element for preventing impacts. And it's a very important tool in the RBC world and the OECD instruments that we provide. And for me, due diligence is really related with compliance. So there is room for improving how we can assist overview. I wouldn't say necessarily overviewing, but at least assisting companies that want to enhance their offensive prevention models, for example, or like this case that I cited where there was a company, the NCP company, the enterprise to foster the trust with the communities where they were engaging with. Now, we are currently as a network in a process of doing a stock taking of the guidelines, which is part of the investment declaration, the review element, it's always there. So we will see what comes from there. The stock taking is just starting, and there might be some news that could have a positive impact in this specific area.
Okay. So it sounds like it's a timely, it's a good moment to try and review to see if you can actually make the improvements that you think could happen.
For sure, and maybe just three elements that I think, answering your last question, like would you have redesigned the mechanism as a whole? I think this is a great mechanism, how it is designed. There are issues that we could enhance in the implementation area. So for example, the relationship with courts, as I've mentioned, how we will address parallel proceedings. This is something that was included in 2011, that we should not avoid our intervention, but that doesn't mean that we can always be a positive intervention. So when we are and where we are not, and I think this is still something to be discussed. Also, someone mentioned this, the improved coordination between public entities. We're not going to solve everything by ourselves. We really need to cooperate and find which are our allies around the context of mechanisms. And just finally, I think NCPs should be trained in every aspect of the guidelines. Sometimes we put a lot of focus on environmental issues, human rights issues, which I know that they're very pressing and important challenges, but we shouldn't leave the anti-corruption area behind, because then we struggle when we receive these cases. And maybe this is me as a coordinator of the anti-bribery convention here, but I think that would make it also more effective.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so in accordance with the principle first in, last out, Juraj?
Thank you, Henry. And I have to say, we got it right. There was nothing wrong with this, with the structure as we have devised it, as we know. But no, seriously, I really think that the original structure was sound. The only problem, unfortunately, is that the law has not been implemented. The law has been part of the structure of the design from the day one, but we could not do the law because we wanted to do the Ombudsman institution very quickly. And so we said, okay, we'll be working on an interim basis, on the basis of a resolution of the government, and then later the law will be implemented. Now, when I look at it, I've just got some numbers, they are not the most, they are not fresh, but nevertheless, I mean, the institution really showed that it has impact. The number of cases received, the number of cases resolved successfully, the satisfaction of the users, all of that. I mean, doesn't matter whether it's 97% or whatever it is, but it's fairly high. And also individual recommendations, 89% of recommendations implemented by the authorities. So it's interesting that the authorities take the institution seriously, but the problem is that they take the institution seriously on the basis of the institution's support from the international community, from international financial institutions. The EBRD usually works together with the IMF. Obviously, IMF funding is needed by the government of Ukraine. So a lot of things are done as a result of international pressure. The institution continues to be funded 100% through the EBRD by our donor member states. Again, that these are all issues which need to be addressed long term, and also what needs to be addressed long term is the need for the law to continue providing teeth of the Ombudsman institution. From what I hear, I was reading some press releases yesterday. The law may not necessarily look the way we wanted to design it. It will not give the same teeth to the institution in terms of the need to work with the institution, to cooperate with the institution in order to give the immunities and privileges to the Ombudsman in the context of the work that he or she is doing, and so on and so forth. So the design is one thing, but often the devil is in detail. And how the detail will look like, it will really depend on the ability of those who have taken over from me and who are now implementing the project in Ukraine, and how well they will be able to find the right balance, to strike the right balance between what we want to see as a design, between what the government wants to see as a design, and then also the political consensus that you need to find within the government and within the parliament. And that is the most difficult thing that in my experience of those years in Ukraine, has been the most difficult to achieve. So nothing wrong with the design, but we'll see how the implementation will go. But overall, it's a very successful project so far. About $750 million returned to businesses over the last 5.5 years. That's a lot of money in Ukraine, in the context of Ukraine.
Sure. Okay, well, listen, thank you very much to all the panelists. I'm looking, your presentations were certainly very interesting. You've generated some comments and there are a couple of questions that I think we can immediately get to. We have a few minutes left, about 15 minutes. So I will go directly to the questions. And there's one from Lisa Rosen, which really is across the board. Have any of the mechanisms changed their approach, or are there different trends as a result of COVID? Anybody want to pick that up? Just raise your hand or just jump in.
I can't. From my former boss to my current boss, Lisa. Unfortunately, I'm not, as you know, I'm with you in London and not back in Ukraine. I do not know what the challenges are, but we have, I think, some colleagues from our Kiev office. I don't know whether they would be able to answer that.
Anybody else on the panel? Has anybody been able to?
Camille has
Sorry, I can't
his
see.
hand run.
Who?
Camille has his
Okay,
hand raised.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. I think, I mean, it hasn't changed, but I think there is also room for improvement in this case, which is the digitization, you know, to digitize the process of for the high-level reporting mechanism, for instance, digitize the process to receive the compliance, receive the reports. There is potential, I see, for instance, for blockchain technology, so you can assure and encrypt the reports of corruption, and then you can encrypt the process by which the report is going through to be assessed by the experts, to encrypt the assessment that the experts are making about the reports on the following procedures, whether or not to report to the judicial authorities or something like that. So I think you can digitize a little bit more the process as a result of the COVID, and make it more efficient, and maybe by using data technologies, you can make it more accountable as well, and gather also evidence about how well the mechanism can work in the future, you know, given this kind of new circumstances, you know, so that's this new context. So
yeah,
that's it.
I think that's very true. The idea of making it more accountable certainly will also go to raising trust in these mechanisms. So it is an opportunity. The COVID crisis has presented challenges, but also opportunities in many ways. And so to whatever extent we can take advantage of these opportunities, it's fantastic. Is there anybody else on the panel who would like to, has an insight on this particular issue? If not, there are some other comments, but I don't think that they're really questions. Otherwise, I think an interesting question, again, that came up in all of your presentations was this issue of how to strike the right balance between the varying interests that are part and parcel of these networks on the private sector side, the companies, the government, etc. How to strike that balance, also requiring a certain amount of independence, but if you have too much independence, does that have the necessary authority and clout with the government authorities? This is something that I think is still something that all of the mechanisms will probably struggle with, but nonetheless, it's inherent in the type of a non-judicial mechanism that you want to have. But I would like the panel to try and address maybe this issue of what would happen in your mechanism if indeed, what is the relation between having to report potential criminal activity to the authorities as a result of information that you gather through the mechanism? And of course, this will impact the trust of companies in using them. But that might be something that, I don't know if anyone would like to address that, but it's certainly something I think of often as a challenge in terms of these mechanisms.
I do not know how the matter will be covered in the law, in the final version of the law, but at the moment what the Ombudsman institution in Ukraine has are different memoranda of understanding with different law enforcement agencies. And on that basis, indeed, that involves cooperation, that involves sharing of information. Obviously, information has to be carefully discussed also with the clients, the parties who seek the resolution of their disputes. So it's done at the moment informally on the basis of memoranda of understanding, but I know that criminal prosecutions have been started as a result of a dialogue between the Ombudsman institution and the relevant agencies. Where they ended up, that I do not know, but I know that several prosecutions, including within the prosecution service, have been commenced as a result of the initiative of the business.
So these prosecutions were a result of reports that were made through the Ombudsman.
That's correct.
And there was an obligation now in the MOU, but will be in the law perhaps, to report those things to the law enforcement authorities.
Well, yes. I mean, it's a very difficult. I do not know how they are going to strike the balance, because indeed, as you said, Henry, you do not want to lose the trust of those who really came to you and often as last resort.
Yeah.
And obviously often the person on the receiving end, the wrongdoer, would very quickly find out who was the one who has given the relevant information. So we'll see where it's going to.
I remember that discussion when we were in Ukraine here, that there may be retribution against people who report. Yeah.
Indeed.
Anybody else on the
Maybe I'll just jump in on this one and say that one of the systemic reports of Ukrainian business ombudsman was actually about corruption in the illegal use of law enforcement against companies. So that, of course, adds another challenge here.
Another layer of complexity. Anybody else on the panel want to address this issue? Yeah, Marcella?
Yeah, thank you. So I think there's two layers here that we see as interesting to try to explore or answer. So one is what you asked. So we receive something. In our case, we are civil servants, and that means that the regulation that is there for responsibility for everyone is to present to the relevant authorities if we receive something that we suspect there is a crime behind. So, but having said that, and having that as part of our responsibilities, that does mean that we are not going to do anything with the case. Is there a space of collaborating with those prosecutions, or not necessarily with the prosecutions, but at least with solving or helping conflict that came to us in parallel with the prosecution? And this deals with the second issue of the parallel proceedings. Sometimes what happens is that there's already a court criminal case, not necessarily against bribery, but another issue. There is a case, nonetheless, the parties come to us for different reasons. Can we contribute there? What's our role when there is already a judicial proceeding and still there is the call for the NCP to intervene? I think two issues of what we do when we receive something that could be a crime and our authorities do not know, and then what do we do when there is a case in courts but still come to us, are very to our role, and more cooperation between different judicial and non-judicial mechanisms could definitely make all the system better. That it's what we want in the end, a strong economy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Guillermo, please.
No, in Argentina, there is a mandatory rule for any public servant that receives a report that might be a crime to start, to defer this to the criminal authorities and start a prosecution. So we were very careful about that, because in cases of systemic corruption, there is no point in, in starting, hundreds of thousands of prosecutions for nothing. Not for nothing, but not to get any results. So our goal was to change the scenario first, move from systemic to very marginal corruption, and then you can start using the criminal law system when crimes are really marginal. But when it's a structural, there is no point. So I mentioned before that we use this the information of the mechanism on aggregate basis for fear of retaliation, but there was another reason, which was exactly this one. We didn't want to show the authorities exactly, the information, because that will force them to go to the criminal authorities. It was mandatory by law. So, so we avoid the criminal prosecution when the corruption was systemic by using aggregate information.
Okay, anyone else?
I think Soji wanted to say something.
Sorry, I didn't see your hand. Soji, please.
In Nigeria, in Nigeria, we actually reported to the presidency with data that the levels of corruption were getting unbearable around 2016. And the Anti-Corruption Commission and some of the other agencies at the ports started to carry out sting operations from then. And late last year, there was actually a story in the newspapers of some immigration officials who were caught coming off a vessel with some cartons of frozen fish. So, which is also, we asked for the consequence management framework because we don't know what happened to them, and we can't really track or trace what became of that. Now, but because we don't carry out investigations, we only make reports, and those reports go through the Shippers Council and through them to all the other agencies. Even when there's something criminal, it's handled government to government. So I don't think that it then becomes a risk for those who are reporting. Yes, there was the fear that there could be retribution, even from refusing the bribes, but many vessels have come and gone so many times without issue that there's confidence now that there won't be retribution for reporting.
Okay, well, I think we've got 2 minutes, and so I think it's really time to wrap up. You've heard across the spectrum that has been used, and I think we have to acknowledge that a lot of these mechanisms were born out of the original idea of the collaboration between OECD and the Basel Institute on high-level reporting mechanisms. So credit where credit is due. And there was also elements of traditional ombudsman that were brought into the picture. So congratulations to all of you. I think you've done a splendid job of talking about your instruments without going into too much boring details. So I think it's been very interesting. I hope it's been interesting for the participants. So thank you all panelists for your time. Thank you to the Secretariat for the support, and also thank you to the participants for their interest in taking part in this discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I've had, and thank you once again. Stay safe, everybody. So we can
Thank you, Enery.
Thank you, Enery, for your wonderful moderation.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.